Margaret thought she was just administering Helen's evening medication when the 87-year-old patient suddenly grabbed her hand and began reciting what sounded like random numbers and code words. She was reaching for the emergency button to report agitation when her NSA training kicked in, and she recognized the pattern: active intelligence regarding a planned cyber attack on the Pentagon's defense systems. Helen's dementia was about to prevent World War III. Welcome to Hidden Legends. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden expertise, forgotten training, and the moment when silence becomes impossible, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us make sure they are. Margaret Chen worked the night shift at Harmony Gardens Nursing Home in Arlington, Virginia, moving through dimly lit hallways with the practiced efficiency of someone who had found peace in routine. For 8 years, she had cared for elderly residents who depended on her for everything from medication administration to simple human companionship during the long hours between dinner and dawn. She was 41 years old, with shoulder-length brown hair, always pulled back in a neat ponytail, and hands that moved with gentle competence as she checked vital signs, adjusted blankets, and provided the kind of attentive care that made families feel comfortable leaving their loved ones in professional hands. Her residents knew her as the quiet night nurse who never rushed, always listened, and had an unusual ability to calm even the most agitated patients. Margaret spoke softly, moved carefully, and maintained the kind of professional demeanor that made her nearly invisible to visitors and day-shift staff who saw her only during brief transition periods. What no one at Harmony Gardens knew was that Margaret's methodical attention to detail, her ability to recognize patterns in seemingly random information, and her calm response to crisis situations came from 15 years as a senior analyst with the National Security Agency. She had specialized in signals intelligence and cryptographic analysis, spending her career identifying threats buried in massive streams of digital communication. Her security clearance had been among the highest levels available to civilian personnel, and her work had contributed to preventing dozens of cyber attacks, terrorism plots, and foreign intelligence operations. Margaret had walked away from NSA 3 years ago after a particularly intensive assignment monitoring North Korean cyber warfare capabilities. The stress of knowing that missing a single detail in millions of data points could result in infrastructure attacks, economic warfare, or worse, had finally overwhelmed her ability to maintain the emotional distance required for that level of responsibility. "I can't spend another day staring at screens looking for patterns that might kill people," she had told Deputy Director Williams during her exit interview. "I need to do something that helps people directly, where I can see the results of my work." So Margaret Chen had traded her security clearance for a nursing license, her computer terminals for patient care equipment, and her role in protecting national security for the simple satisfaction of caring for individuals who needed her help. For 3 years, she had found genuine peace in work that was immediate, personal, and free from the weight of global consequences. She helped elderly residents maintain dignity and comfort during their final years, provided emotional support to families dealing with progressive illness, and discovered that caring for people one at a time was more fulfilling than protecting millions through anonymous analysis work. But some training creates permanent changes in how you process information, and Margaret's mind continued to recognize patterns even when she wasn't looking for them. Helen Patterson had been a resident of Harmony Gardens for 14 months, admitted after a stroke that had left her with severe cognitive impairment and limited communication ability. Her family visited regularly but briefly, finding it difficult to connect with someone who rarely recognized them and spoke only in fragments that seemed unrelated to reality. Margaret had been Helen's primary night caregiver since her admission, helping with medications, personal care, and the gentle reassurance that confused patients needed during dark hours when disorientation was typically most severe. Helen was one of her easier residents, quiet, cooperative, and requiring minimal intervention beyond basic care needs. Helen's background, according to her admission files, included 40 years as a government secretary before retirement. Her family described her as someone who had always been intensely private about her work, claiming that government jobs required discretion without providing specific details about her duties or responsibilities. What Margaret noticed, but hadn't consciously analyzed, was that Helen's periods of clarity seemed to follow patterns related to current events. When news reports mentioned international tensions or cybersecurity incidents, Helen became more agitated, more verbal, and more likely to speak in the disconnected phrases that staff attributed to progressive dementia. Margaret had also observed that Helen's random utterances often included technical terminology that seemed unusually sophisticated for someone whose career had supposedly involved routine clerical work. References to encryption protocols, network security measures, and digital infrastructure that suggested familiarity with concepts most people never encountered. But Margaret had deliberately avoided applying her analytical training to her nursing work. She was no longer an intelligence analyst. She was a caregiver whose job was providing comfort to confused elderly residents, not decoding their statements for hidden meanings. That changed on Tuesday evening when Helen grabbed her wrist with surprising strength and spoke with a clarity that had been absent since her admission 14 months earlier. Margaret was administering Helen's evening blood pressure medication at exactly 9:47 p.m. when the elderly woman suddenly gripped her forearm with strength that seemed impossible for someone in her condition. "The firewall protocols are compromised," Helen said, her voice clear and urgent in a way that Margaret had never heard before. "Beijing has root access to Pentagon systems through the auxiliary server farm in Virginia." Margaret paused, medication cup still in her hand, staring at Helen's eyes, which had suddenly gained the focused intensity of someone completely present and alert. "Helen," Margaret said gently, "it's medication time. Can you take your pills?" But Helen wasn't finished. She began reciting a series of numbers and technical terms with mechanical precision. Vulnerability Identifier, CVE 2024-8847, Exploitation Vector, through Legacy Authentication Systems, estimated timeline for deployment 72 hours maximum. Margaret's NSA training activated automatically. She recognized the terminology, understood the technical references, and realized that Helen was describing a sophisticated cyber attack with the precision of someone who possessed current, detailed intelligence about classified defense systems. "Margaret," Helen continued, using the nurse's name for the first time since admission, "you need to understand what I'm telling you. This isn't confusion. This isn't dementia. They've been planning this for months, and I've been monitoring their communications." Margaret set down the medication and sat on the edge of Helen's bed, suddenly paying complete attention. "Helen, what are you talking about?" "My name isn't Helen Patterson," the elderly woman said, her voice carrying authority that belonged to someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "I'm Dr. Helen Chen, former Deputy Director of NSA Cyber Operations Division, and everything I've told you indicates an imminent attack on United States defense infrastructure." The revelation hit Margaret like ice water. She stared at the woman she had been caring for over a year, seeing her clearly for the first time. The confusion that had seemed like cognitive decline suddenly appeared to be something else entirely, the careful monitoring of classified information by someone whose training had never stopped, even when everyone around her assumed she was no longer capable of coherent thought. "Prove it," Margaret said, her own analytical training demanding verification. Helen smiled slightly, the expression of someone who had been waiting for exactly that question. "Margaret Chen, NSA, Employee Identification Number 7294, Signals Intelligence Specialist with Cryptographic Analysis Certification. You resigned 3 years ago after the North Korea assignment because the stress was affecting your sleep patterns and personal relationships." Margaret's breath caught. That information wasn't in any public record, wasn't something that could be guessed or deduced from casual observation. Only someone with access to highly classified personnel files would know those details. "How do you know that?" Margaret whispered. "Because I approved your security clearance 15 years ago," Helen replied. "And I've been watching you work here for 14 months, hoping that someday you'd be ready to hear what I needed to tell you." Margaret looked around Helen's room with new eyes, suddenly recognizing details she had dismissed as eccentric behavior or family decorations. The small radio by Helen's bed wasn't tuned to music stations. It was positioned to receive specific frequencies. The seemingly random arrangement of books on her nightstand actually formed a pattern that Margaret now recognized as a basic cryptographic reference system. "Helen," Margaret said, "if you're really NSA, why are you here? Why the Dementia Act?" Helen's expression grew serious. "Because 3 years ago, I discovered evidence of a long-term infiltration operation targeting U.S. cyber defense systems. When I tried to report it through official channels, I realized the infiltration included personnel within the intelligence community itself." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of scenario that NSA analysts were trained to recognize and counter. Foreign intelligence operations that had achieved deep penetration of American security systems. "I had to disappear," Helen continued, "fake the stroke, assume a cover identity, and continue monitoring the operation from a position where no one would suspect surveillance capability. Nursing homes are perfect cover. Who suspects a dementia patient of conducting intelligence work?" "But why tell me now?" Margaret asked. Helen reached under her pillow and withdrew a small device that Margaret recognized immediately, an encrypted communication unit used for classified message transmission. "Because the operation has reached final phases. They're planning to execute the cyber attack within 72 hours, and I need someone with your analytical background to help me stop it." Margaret stared at the communication device, then at Helen, then at the door to ensure they weren't being overheard. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Help me decode the final attack protocols," Helen said. "I've been intercepting their communications for months, but the encryption has evolved beyond what I can break alone. With your signals intelligence background and my operational knowledge, we can identify their target systems and alert appropriate countermeasures." Margaret's hands were shaking slightly as she processed the implications. "Helen, if you're right about this, we're talking about a threat to national security that requires immediate response from active intelligence agencies." "Active agencies that may include compromised personnel," Helen reminded her. "Margaret, I know you left NSA to find peace, to get away from this kind of responsibility. But sometimes the skills we develop choose when they're needed, not when we're ready to use them." Margaret looked at the elderly woman who had just revealed herself to be one of the most senior intelligence professionals in American history, asking for help with an operation that could affect national security. 3 years ago, she had walked away from exactly this kind of responsibility. Tonight, that responsibility had found her anyway. Margaret spent the next hour reviewing intelligence materials that Helen had been secretly collecting and analyzing throughout her months at Harmony Gardens. The scope of the infiltration operation was breathtaking. Foreign operatives had achieved access to multiple layers of Pentagon cyber infrastructure and were preparing coordinated attacks on defense communications, weapons systems, and command networks. "The attack is scheduled for Thursday morning at 0600 Eastern. Helen explained, showing Margaret encrypted communications she had intercepted. "During the shift change, when system monitoring is traditionally weakest." Margaret applied her cryptographic analysis skills to the intercepted data, recognizing patterns and techniques that confirmed Helen's assessment. The operation was sophisticated, well-planned, and positioned to cause catastrophic damage to American defense capabilities. "We need to alert NSA immediately," Margaret said. "With what?" Helen replied. "I'm officially a dementia patient with no security clearance. You're a former analyst with no current access. Who's going to believe us without verification that would take days to obtain?" Margaret realized the dilemma. Standard protocols required verification through official channels that might be compromised, and time constraints made elaborate authentication impossible. "What do you propose?" she asked. Helen smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had been planning for exactly this moment. "We bypass official channels and contact the one person who knows both of our backgrounds and has authority to act immediately." She handed Margaret a secure phone with a single number programmed into its memory. "Deputy Director Williams, your former supervisor. She's now Director of Cyber Operations and has direct access to emergency response protocols." Margaret stared at the phone, knowing that making the call would end her 3 years of peaceful anonymity and pull her back into the world of intelligence operations she had worked so hard to escape. "Margaret," Helen said quietly, "I understand why you left NSA. The stress, the responsibility, the weight of knowing that mistakes cost lives. But tonight, not acting will cost more lives than any mistake we could make." At 11:23 p.m., Margaret dialed the number and waited for the connection that would change everything. Director Williams answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the alertness of someone accustomed to emergency calls at unusual hours. "This is Williams." "Director, this is Margaret Chen, former Signals Intelligence Analyst. I have Dr. Helen Chen with me, former Deputy Director of Cyber Ops. We have intelligence regarding an imminent cyber attack on Pentagon defense systems." There was a pause. Then Williams's voice became intensely focused. "Margaret, Helen Chen died in a car accident 18 months ago. Her memorial service was classified because of her operational background." Helen took the phone with steady hands. "Patricia, this is Helen. The car accident was staged to provide cover for deep infiltration surveillance. I'm alive, I'm operational, and we have 31 hours to prevent the most sophisticated cyber attack in U.S. history." What followed was 15 minutes of authentication protocols, verification questions, and technical discussions that confirmed Helen's identity and validated the intelligence they had collected. Director Williams arranged immediate extraction from the nursing home and emergency briefing at NSA headquarters. The cyber attack was prevented with 8 hours to spare. Helen's intelligence led to the identification and arrest of 17 foreign operatives working within U.S. government systems, and Margaret's analytical work helped decode the final attack protocols that allowed defensive countermeasures to be implemented before any damage occurred. Helen returned to active NSA service with a promotion to Senior Operations Director. Margaret accepted a consulting position that allowed her to continue working at Harmony Gardens while providing part-time intelligence analysis for high-priority cases. 6 months later, Margaret still worked the night shift at the nursing home, still cared for elderly residents who needed her help. But now she also carried a secure communication device that provided direct access to NSA emergency protocols, and her observations were part of an expanded network monitoring potential security threats. Helen, now recovered from her staged death and operating under her real identity, visited Harmony Gardens regularly, officially as a volunteer reading to residents, unofficially to maintain contact with someone who had proven that the most important intelligence work sometimes happens in the most unexpected places. Margaret had learned that serving your country doesn't always require working in classified facilities or carrying official credentials. Sometimes the most important protection comes from people who notice what others miss, who trust their training when situations demand action, and who understand that some responsibilities never truly end. The nursing home residents never learned that their quiet night caregiver had helped prevent a cyber attack that could have crippled American defense systems. But Margaret knew, and that knowledge provided the purpose she had been seeking since leaving NSA. Sometimes the most crucial work happens quietly, performed by people who use skills developed in one career to serve in completely different roles. Margaret Chen had discovered that protecting people, whether that meant analyzing cyber threats or administering medication to elderly patients, was always the same mission, making sure everyone stays safe. Thank you for joining us at Hidden Legends. If Margaret's story moved you, remember that expertise never really disappears, and the training that shapes us often finds ways to serve when we least expect it. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and who are the quiet guardians in your community? Until next time, keep your eyes open. The next person who protects your world might be caring for someone else's grandmother, watching carefully, ready to act when the moment demands.